Well, today we ask, do we need stricter protest laws? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by journalist Nicole Lampert, co-executive director of Greenpeace, Will McCallum, former detective chief inspector in the Met Police and the head of crime and justice at the Policy Exchange, David Spencer, and the director of the campaign group Liberty, Akiko Hart. Good to see you all. Thanks for coming in. Akiko, I'll start with you. Some of the measures being brought in include banning the use of fireworks, climbing on war memorials and banning face coverings. MPs have mentioned feeling uneasy about walking to work through protests, going to Parliament. If people feel intimidated or scared about protests, measures like this are important, aren't they?
So the police already have immense powers to restrict protest. What we've seen in the last few years are two big pieces of anti-protest legislation. And the issue here is that these protest restrictions won't make us feel safer, won't make things better, but it will take away our rights. So essentially, we are at a moment in time where there's huge community tension. A lot of communities, are experiencing fear. But what happens when you restrict the right to protest is that you're likely to fuel those tensions because you're taking away safe and legal ways for people to make their voices heard. And I think with any anti-protest legislation, what we need to do is zoom out, because when you make laws, you don't just make laws in response to current events, you've got to future-proof them. And we've got to think about what this kind of law looks like in 5 or 10 years' time under a very different kind of government. The right to protest is central to our democracy.
Yeah,
and we have to fight for it.
David, that's interesting, thinking about actually future-proofing them. I mean, let's just look back at the past. The suffragette protest, that lasted for 10 years. So this idea of the prolonged protests and preventing that. Suffragettes getting the vote for women in Britain, that's like one of the best protests and effective protests and important protests in our democracy. And yet that wouldn't have been possible to do it for over 10 years.
There's two things here. First of all, almost every adult in Britain has the right to vote, which over a century ago with the suffragettes, that wasn't the case. So if you disagree with the law, you disagree with what politicians are saying, then you can vote for different politicians or stand for election yourself. And in terms of the right to protest that Akiko talks about, the reality is the Human Rights Act doesn't talk about the right to protest. It talks about the right to freedom of expression and the right to peaceful assembly. And what we've been seeing, particularly in the last couple of years, is a long way from peaceful assembly. When you've got people calling on the streets of London for jihad, when you've got people calling to globalise the intifada, when you've seen some of the disruption, some of the disturbance, some of the violent scenes in some isolated occasions, that is far from peaceful assembly that we've been seeing on our streets.
I mean, I can see, Nicole, you're nodding there, but I just want to get Will's response there. Those things aren't good. They intimidate people. They're really uncomfortable when you hear that stuff.
It's really uncomfortable to hear that stuff, and obviously we don't want people to be walking down the streets feeling fear or feeling unsafe. But protest still remains that hallmark of democracy. I think throughout history we've always seen protests create disruption. We've seen protest be uncomfortable for, in particular, those in power, because by its nature, protest is challenging people to do something that they either aren't already doing or sometimes don't want to do, whether that's civil rights, whether it's the suffragette movement, like you just mentioned.
But how can we make people feel safe if we don't have these laws, though?
I think, to Akiko's point, the police already have a lot of powers. Between 2022 and 2024, there were more than 700 protests that already had police conditions attached to them. The police already have the power to disperse crowds. They already have the power to deal with noise, to deal with hate speech, to deal with incitement to violence. Adding more laws, I was really struck by the Greater Manchester Police Chief Inspector on the radio earlier this week when he was saying they just create more confusion on the ground for the policing of protests.
So let's put that to Nicole. We've already got the laws. Let's just get on with what we've got.
I mean, I would agree with that in that we have the laws. It's just about enforcing them. So when you've got people calling for the death of Jews by globalising the intifada, and then we saw exactly that happen in Manchester last week, that's when we have a problem. So we need to enforce them. We need to. There are laws about distress and things like that, and harassment against minorities and races, and they've not been abided by. Even yesterday, I wasn't in London. I was in Brighton. I was at a feminist conference, and just the day earlier, the windows had been smashed in by protesters. And instead of keeping the protesters on the other side of the road, as had been asked by organisers, everyone that was going to the conference had to go past this gamut of haters, both trans rights activists and Palestine activists, often the same, often screaming things like baby killers, genocide, bigots, fascists, all of this kind of thing. So it's gone beyond peaceful protest, which I completely agree with, to something which is intimidatory and dangerous, as we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, so Kiko, I get the principle and what you and Will are both saying, but when you hear of individual cases like that, does that make you think, well, maybe I need to soften my stance a bit, because that doesn't sound good?
So can I come back to you on the chance? Because I think it's a really, really interesting question, because it kind of like comes down to like, what is freedom of speech? And, freedom of speech is not absolute. It's never been absolute. It's not now. It never will be. There's all sorts of laws around it, like libel. And speech is contextual, right? It depends who's saying it, who you're saying it to, what the intent is. And within freedom of speech, it allows for essentially being offensive, being very offensive, because if you can't be offensive, then you don't have freedom of speech. And what is interesting about some of these chants is that the police have looked into them and have decided they do not cross the threshold into hate speech, because hate speech is something else. Hate speech is abusive or threatening language.
Which those things are.
But the police have looked at it and have decided it doesn't cross that line.
But in other countries, they have said that they do cross the line. So there is, it in itself is a debate, and it's one where the Jewish community is certainly not being heard.
I mean, if you were to walk some steps in someone's shoes who does find it offensive, it is offensive and it is difficult.
Offensive.
And beyond offensive, it's dangerous. We literally saw 2 men being killed last week. We saw the globalisation of the Intifada, and yet people yesterday were still crying, globalise the Intifada. Intifada is danger.
OK, let's let Kiko. I mean,
I don't think you can make the link between chants at a march and the terrorist attack. I don't think you can prove that. And so they're 2 separate issues. But I do agree with you that the line about where you draw hate speech, that is a live one, and it's being read differently in different countries. But we must be so careful about restricting freedom of expression.
Are we in danger, David, of this throwing out the baby with the bathwater? So I get some of the things you're saying about keeping the peace, but actually we're losing some really fundamental values that Will and Akiko are talking about, that we've had in our democracy for decades.
Well, as Akiko rightly says, these are qualified rights. They're not absolute rights, and they are qualified to ensure the safety of the public, to make sure that actually we're all kept safe, to balance the rights between people disrupting or doing demonstrations and other people. So these are qualified rights. They've never been absolute rights, and that's a really important point which we shouldn't lose. I think the other thing here as well, for someone who was a police officer, we do currently have huge powers and legislation which cover protests. There's no doubt that that is correct. But what we see time and again is the police failing to use some of those powers in the way that they should. The other thing from a policing perspective is just the sheer number of police officers who are deployed dealing with these protests to try their best to keep them safe, rather than policing local communities, dealing with shoplifting, burglary, robbery, drug dealing.
Okay,
and that's really problematic as well.
That is problematic, and that's a political choice to be diverting those police resources towards peaceful assembly instead of dealing with crime on the street. I think, we absolutely don't want to see police time being wasted pulling pensioners off of a square in the middle of London. We'd much prefer that they were out dealing with real crime. So I think, fully agreeing with you there, and
but they're not peaceful protests. In so many cases, not all, I'm not saying all, but in so many cases they're not peaceful. And actually, to maintain to try and keep the lid on these things, it does require huge numbers of police officers to deal with these protests.
So why have things changed then? Why are you saying that these things aren't peaceful, but they were, say, 10, 20 years ago, things were fine? Why do the rules need to change now, do you feel?
Well, the rules around...
Things got worse.
The rules around, as I say, there's loads of rules and laws around protests. There are some areas which we would say at Policy Exchange they need to change, but actually not huge changes in reality. But what we're seeing time and again is the vast numbers of people who are protesting on the streets with huge amounts of noise and disruption, all the rest of it. And that, certainly over the last couple of years, has been really problematic.
Yeah. Nicole, since the COVID restrictions were implemented, of course, in 2020, which included banning public gatherings. A year later, the police were given more powers before further anti-protest legislation was brought in 2023. In 2024, the threshold around what constituted a protest was lowered, and now this. You can see why people are a little bit worried about where we're going with this. There's just a sort of chipping away at what we could do before.
Yeah, you know, as I said before, I don't mind. I don't think that we necessarily need to initiate more laws. In fact, in some ways, it feels like this is the government kicking the can down the road and saying, oh, we can make things better once we do these laws. When actually, what they don't want to discuss is the violence, the violent protests on our streets, and they are violent. There were 40 arrests just last week, and even the Palestine Action ones. The people themselves may not be being violent themselves, but they are supporting a violent terrorist group.
OK. I mean, Akiko, you're raising your eyebrows there, but I feel like is there some agreement there? Because you're saying we've got laws and we need to enforce them, and you're saying we've got laws and we shouldn't need to stick with them. So that's agreement, is it not?
I think there is a level, you know, of agreements here. And, you know, what I was thinking about actually was your point about the practice. And actually, if you look at Northern Ireland, what they have there is a parades commission. And the parades commission attempts to bring together different stakeholders around protests. So those will be communities, including faith communities, and the police and the march organisers. And every single march that happens, every single protest that happens in Northern Ireland goes through this parades commission. And I think something like that would be a far more fruitful, you know, possibility than just, you know, bringing in new laws.
So Will, how can we protect the right to protest, but also make the public feel safe? Because I know you don't see that, but there are lots of people who don't feel safe, and that's why we're discussing this now.
There are lots of people who don't feel safe, I've no doubt of that. There are also lots of people who don't feel safe at the end of a football match or at the end of a music concert. You know, large gatherings of people in many forms often make people
Is that
not
fair
feel safe.
to compare a football match?
I'm saying no one is comparing them, and I am interested in why. I think that the like we've already said a lot of times, the police already have a lot of powers to deal with violence, to deal with incitement to violence, to deal with hate speech. I think we have to protect protests in part by recognising that protest is always disruptive. You know, this rhetoric that disruption is bad, I think ultimately only goes in the direction of clamping down on freedom of expression, on freedom to protest. Protest is always disruptive, and some of the most amazing bits of progress through history arose through disruptive protest. Yeah. Suffragettes is a long time ago, civil rights much more recently. Anti-apartheid, you know, there were plenty of people sitting in Parliament at the time who said that the anti-apartheid protesters were supporting terrorists. Yeah.
OK. I'm afraid we have restrictions on time in the show, and I'm not going to take any protest of that because we really are out of time. So thank you very much indeed.